The Young and the Restless spoilers shock. Faith Newman couldn't believe her ears as she listened to her mother Sharon weave a dark web of lies and deceit. It was as though the woman she once admired had transformed into someone unrecognizable. Someone capable of harboring such malice that it sent chills down her spine. Sharon's plan was not only cruel but utterly destructive, and the realization that her mother was behind it all left Faith reeling in shock. For days, Faith had tried to reason with Sharon, desperate to make her understand that Lucy was not the villain in this twisted tale. Lucy, with her innocent eyes and kind heart, had been nothing but a friend, someone who had stood by Faith in her darkest hours. The night of the accident had been a tragic mistake, not the malicious act Sharon was so determined to portray it as. Faith remembered that night vividly. She had been the one who, despite being intoxicated, ventured out into the freezing cold to rescue Lucy. Icy wind had cut through her like a knife, but she had pressed on, knowing that Lucy needed her. They had been foolish, yes, but they had acted out of a desire to protect one another, not to cause harm. The accident that followed was a cruel twist of fate, something no one could have predicted. The car had skidded on the icy road, spinning out of control before crashing into a ditch. Both girls had been terrified, but they had survived, bruised and shaken. Faith knew she should have called an adult or hailed a taxi to ensure their safe return, but in her impaired state, her judgment had been clouded. Still, she couldn't bear the thought of Lucy taking the fall for something that was equally her fault. Faith had tried to explain this to Sharon, pleading with her to see reason, understand that Lucy was not to blame. But Sharon's eyes had been cold, her mind made up. "Lucy is nothing but trouble," she had declared, her voice devoid of any warmth or compassion. And now she must face the consequences. Faith's heart had pounded in her chest as she realized that Sharon had no intention of letting this go. Her mother was determined to make Lucy pay, regardless of the truth. The rage that had built up inside Faith was unlike anything she had ever felt before. She had tried to reason with Sharon, but it was like talking to a wall. Sharon was beyond reasoning, consumed by an irrational hatred that Faith couldn't comprehend. Desperation had driven Faith to a breaking point. She threatened to call the police, or worse, to get her father, Nick, involved. She knew Nick would never stand for this. He would protect Lucy, just as he had always protected Faith. Sharon had laughed in her face, a bitter, hollow sound that sent a shiver down Faith's spine. "Go ahead, call him," Sharon had sneered. "But don't expect me to sit back and do nothing. If you keep pushing this, you'll start a war you can't win." Faith had never felt more alone. Her mother, the woman who was supposed to love and protect her, was now the enemy. She had no choice. She had to stop Sharon before things got even worse. She couldn't let her mother's vendetta destroy another innocent life. Her hands trembling, Faith had picked up the phone and dialed the number she knew by heart. The words tumbled out of her mouth in a frantic rush, barely coherent as she told the police everything. About Sharon's plan, about the accident, about the threats. She knew there was no turning back now. She had crossed a line, and there was no undoing it. The police arrived swiftly, their flashing lights casting eerie shadows on the walls of the Newman residence. Sharon's face had been a mask of fury when she realized what Faith had done. "How could you?" she had spat, her eyes blazing with a mixture of anger and betrayal. "You're my daughter, and you've just destroyed everything." But Faith stood her ground, heart pounding in her chest. She knew she had done the right thing, even if it meant turning her back on her own mother. She couldn't let Sharon's hatred consume them all. The police took Sharon into custody, her hands cuffed behind her back as they led her away. She didn't struggle, didn't fight. Instead, she stared straight ahead, her face a mask of cold indifference. But Faith could see the cracks forming, the realization that this was it. There was no escaping the consequences of her actions. As the police car pulled away, Faith felt a heavy weight settle in her chest. She had done what she had to do, but that didn't make it any easier. Her mother was gone, taken away to be evaluated for her mental state, and Faith was left standing in the cold, dark night, feeling more alone than ever. Inside, the house was eerily silent. The warmth that had once filled the rooms was gone, replaced by a chilling emptiness that seemed to echo Faith's own despair. She knew that things would never be the same. The bond between mother and daughter had been shattered, possibly beyond repair. But Faith also knew that she couldn't allow herself to be consumed by guilt. She had made a choice, and now she had to live with it. She had to believe that she had done the right thing, even if it meant standing alone. As she stood in the quiet house, Faith couldn't help but wonder what the future held. Would Sharon ever forgive her? Would they ever be able to rebuild the trust that had been broken? Or would this be the beginning of a new chapter, one filled with uncertainty and fear? Only time would tell, but for now, Faith could only hope that her actions would bring some measure of peace, not only for herself but for Lucy as well. She knew the road ahead would be difficult, filled with challenges and heartache, but she was determined to face it head-on, no matter what. The days that followed were a blur of emotions: anger, sorrow, guilt, and fear, all mingling together in a whirlwind that left Faith exhausted and drained. She tried to reach out to Nick. The words wouldn't come. How could she explain what had happened? How could she make him understand the impossible choice she had been forced to make? And then, there was Lucy. The guilt of involving her friend in this nightmare weighed heavily on Faith's heart. She wanted to protect Lucy, to shield her from the fallout of Sharon's actions. She wasn't sure how. Lucy was strong, but even the strongest people had their limits. Faith feared that this might push her friend to the brink. When the police finally called, it was to inform Faith that Sharon would be undergoing a psychiatric evaluation. The words hit her like a punch to the gut. She knew her mother wasn't well, that something had been off for a long time, but hearing it confirmed was like a slap in the face. Sharon, the woman who had always been so strong, so in control, was now being labeled as unstable. It was a bitter pill to swallow. But as much as it hurt, Faith knew that this was the best thing for everyone. Sharon needed help, and this was the only way she would get it. Didn't make the situation any easier, but it gave Faith a small glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, things could get better. In the days that followed, Faith visited Sharon at the hospital. It was hard, seeing her mother in such a vulnerable state, but it was also necessary. They had a lot to talk about, a lot to work through. Sharon's anger had faded, replaced by a quiet resignation that was almost more painful to witness. "I didn't mean for things to get so out of hand," Sharon had confessed during one of Faith's visits, her voice trembling with emotion. "I was scared, Faith. Scared of losing you, scared of losing everything. I didn't know how to stop." Faith had listened, her heart breaking for the woman who had once been her rock. She knew Sharon's intentions had been misguided, but they had come from a place of fear and love. It didn't excuse what she had done, but it made it easier to understand. In the end, Faith realized that forgiveness was the only way forward. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't happen overnight, but she knew that holding on to anger and resentment would only destroy them both. They had to find a way to heal, to rebuild the trusts that had been shattered. As she left the hospital that day, Faith felt a sense of peace that had eluded her for weeks. She had done the right thing, even if it had been the hardest thing she had ever done. And now, it was time to move forward, to find a way to live with the choices they had made. The future was uncertain, but Faith knew one thing for sure. She would face it head-on, with courage and strength. She had learned the hard way that life was full of difficult decisions, but she also knew that she was strong enough to make them. And with that knowledge, she was ready to take on whatever challenges lay ahead.